This is our teaching video for the fourth Sunday of Advent entitled Joseph, Dearest. As you might imagine then, our readings, at least the one we're going to talk about the most, has to do with Joseph, the father of Jesus. But if you want to read ahead for Sunday, we have the prophet Isaiah again, chapter 7, 10 through 16. We also have Romans 1, 1 through 7. And we have Matthew 1, 18 through 25. Now, if the term Joseph, Dearest is familiar to you, you might know the German hymn from which it comes. And if you don't know that hymn, you should maybe take a moment and listen to it. It talks about crowning Jesus with the diadem of our love. And it also talks about asking Joseph to teach us how to embrace the child. Now, because the reading is about Joseph in Matthew 1, it gives us another word to associate with Christmas that we may not always think about, and that is crisis. Now, oftentimes if we think about a Christmas crisis, we think about, oh, I didn't make my flight, or there's going to be a storm, or I wasn't able to purchase. I haven't found a gift for my spouse. What am I supposed to get for them? But this is a more human crisis, and the crisis is the pregnancy. Now, if you've been to many hospitals in the area, you've seen this site, or this sign, Safe Surrender Site. And of course, that's where if you have a newborn and you would like to bring them to the hospital, you can bring them to the hospital or to a fire station and have the child taken care of. And it's really surrendering the baby, because we know that both pregnancy and delivery and having a newborn can be a crisis. It can be the greatest thing in your life, or it can be or feel like the worst thing that's ever happened. And so we want to take a moment and remember that Christmas contains within it the crisis of a pregnancy and a birth. And the person who has to struggle with it, in our case, is Joseph. Because all of a sudden, his fiancée, and for them to be betrothed was even stronger than being a fiancée, she shows up pregnant. And you don't have to be a fool to say, well, I didn't do it, so someone else must have. And so immediately in Matthew 1, we have the crisis of Christmas that's then resolved in an interesting way. Well, the resolution that Joseph experiences in Matthew is with a dream. Now, this is where we start to connect the dots between the New Testament and the Old Testament. So we have a guy named Joseph, and he's a dreamer. Because it turns out this isn't the first and only dream he's going to have. It's the first of 3 dreams. So dream number 1 is going to be take Mary as your wife, raise the child who's come from the Holy Spirit. Dream number 2 will be go to Egypt. Dream number 3 will be come back to the land of Palestine. Come back home. Don't go to Judea. They end up in Nazareth. So it's actually Joseph who has multiple dreams. Now, interestingly enough, there are only 2 of the Gospels that talk about Jesus and his birth, and those are Matthew and Luke. And both Matthew and Luke have genealogies of Jesus. Now, oftentimes when we look at a genealogy of Jesus, or a genealogy at all in the Bible, we roll our eyes and we yawn and say, is it over yet? But you need to pay attention to the genealogies, because the genealogies tell us something about how that gospel is going to tell the story. And if you notice, in the genealogy of Matthew, Joseph is connected to King David through Solomon. We'll just put David here in case you forget. In Luke, Joseph is connected to David through someone named Nathan. Now, if you follow their genealogies then, you end up with different names from the time of David to the time of Joseph. If you look in Matthew's story, Joseph is related to David through Solomon by Jacob. And if you look in Luke, it's by Heli. Okay, now, if we think about this for a second, we can erase Luke's genealogy because we don't really need it. We're not really talking about the Gospel of Luke. We're not in the Gospel of Luke this year. But now we can take some of those dots that we connected to the Old Testament and connect them even more. So we have a Joseph who dreams, and that Joseph, who comes to us in the book of Genesis, has a father, and Joseph's father is named Jacob, just like Joseph in the Gospel of Matthew, and that's why that genealogy is important. Now, Not only do we have Jacob, the father of Joseph the dreamer, but this Joseph, where does he end up? He ends up in Egypt. And so when Joseph gets sent to Egypt in the Gospel of Matthew, it's almost as if he's reliving the experience of the ancestors. And the Gospels make a very clear connection between Jesus who comes, but Jesus who comes is the one who contains within himself the fulfillment of all Israel's history in one person. So one person kind of relives the story and himself becomes the sign of redemption. And then it's not Joseph who brings them home, at least in the Gospel of the book of Genesis. The person who brings them home ends up being Moses. And so Joseph's going to come to the promised land and set the stage for Jesus' ministry. And in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has a kind of new Moses identity. And so one of the most, if not the most important person in the Old Testament, Jesus is connected to him through Jacob, Joseph, the experience in Egypt, and the experience of coming home. And now Jesus is set up as a new Moses. So this is why it's important for us to have these videos. I'm not going to go into that in a sermon, but it's important for us to recognize some of the themes that we're going to see with Matthew. And then in fact, the crisis God addresses with a dream, and Joseph the dreamer listens. And we might say that Joseph probably had plans for his life that were different, but God's vision is something that he follows, and so he puts away his own desires to follow God's vision. And sometimes you have to put away your own desires to follow God's vision for your life. Let's take a moment now to look at some art related to Joseph, and this is an interesting question for us to think about with the man. And that is, how old was Joseph? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us, but certainly some traditions in the church sprang up early. And here you see in this altarpiece, and you can't see the whole thing, but you see the parts we want to show you, we see Joseph sitting over here as an older man. So we see Joseph working, and of course he's working as a carpenter. Now the word that they use for Joseph is really just kind of general for artisan, so he could have done other work. But very early on in the church's history, they talk about Joseph being a carpenter. And in fact, one of the early witnesses, Justin, talks about Jesus specializing in plows and the oxen yoke, or just yoke, maybe more than even oxen. So we see Joseph here working. Here we see Mary being visited by the angel Gabriel. And if you look up here, it's kind of hard to see. You see light streaming through the window and a little almost cherub carrying a cross. That's the Holy Spirit. If we follow this line, we see this candle's blown out, and that's a sign of kind of the breath of God coming and making Mary pregnant with Jesus. And then this detail is probably hard to see. This is a little mousetrap that Joseph is building. And it's not uncommon in Christian art to see mousetraps. And the idea is when Jesus takes on flesh, it becomes bait for the devil. The devil comes and takes the bait and gets caught in the trap, and humanity is set free. So Joseph making the mousetrap, we can parallel with the Holy Spirit making Jesus within the womb of Mary. Now, the Bible doesn't say that Joseph was old, but it kind of clears up a lot if he was, because if Joseph's old, that would explain where the other children come from in the story, that Joseph had been married previously and is much older than Mary. And it also would explain why he disappears, that in fact he has died by the time Jesus is an adult. And really the last we hear of Joseph is when Jesus is 12 and disappears in the temple, or gets lost. Now, this is a different picture of Joseph, and I like this picture quite a bit. And this is Joseph as a younger man embracing Jesus. And I like this picture because it also challenges us with, well, what if he was younger? What if he had his whole life ahead of him? And the challenges of a younger man following the dreams. And this would fit with Joseph from Genesis, who was also a younger man. And so we might say that part of the journey of Joseph is also the journey of the Christian. How do you go from the crisis of Jesus, the crisis of Christmas, to embracing him and saying, yes, you belong to me, and I belong to you. And we see that a little bit in the interchange here. The Father who cradles the Son's head, and the Son who embraces the Father. But the Son who holds the cross to the place he's going. Now this is Rembrandt, and this is one of Joseph's dreams. We'll see if we can pull it up here. There we go. And this is obviously after the birth of Jesus, but this is Rembrandt Again, with more of a younger Joseph, but maybe we can't tell too many details, and the angel saying, "Get up." So sometimes God sends you a message, "Get up. Don't be afraid. Go to this new place and see my plan for you unfold." And that's really what Joseph has to experience. All right, the last thing for us is just to remember this name appears in several places on Sunday, Emmanuel, God with us. This is such a beautiful name, and it's something we should reflect on prayerfully. It's God with us. It's God for us. So when Jesus comes in the flesh, there's a certain solidarity with human beings. When Moses embraces the child, he fulfills, yes, God will be with us. And this is really the good news of Christmas, that God is with us. And because God is with us and for us, there's a path forward. So in the same way that the people left Egypt with the first Moses and were set free and find a home, so now we too are set free by the second Moses, who brings us to a home and gives us the deepest meaning of our lives. We'll see you on Sunday.